Well, hi, Ben.
Hi, how are you guys?
Hi. Well, Ben, we have officially invited Tasia to be my co-host. So
Yeah,
he is here to
he's
provide some comic relief, uh, a little bit more.
Thanks, buddy.
he's like your Andy Richter. That's the little.
Who's Andy Richter?
He
No,
was
we're too young to get that reference, Ben.
he was Conan's co-host. He was really
Oh.
good. Yeah, he had his own little career and everything. It's great.
Well, I think that's a compliment for you, Tasia. That's
It
fine.
is. It is
I think it's a
actually great.
compliment for you.
Nice little backhand compliment. That's good. I appreciate that. So I know we have a plan to talk to Ben about how he hires salespeople and his views on doing it well. But Ben used to be a mountaineer and you know this about him, I think, right? And he used to live in Wyoming and Montana
Yeah,
What?
yeah,
and climb mountains and like
yeah,
be
yeah,
like a skier,
yeah,
snowboarder, avid person. And so I think actually like that's a really interesting place to start because like from a personality standpoint, he spikes high and like independence, adventure seeking, like ownership, right? Because you're out there, basically all you got is yourself. And if I were to think about his philosophy in building his team, that's what he looks for, and like
He's
strip
like
away all the
independence.
ownership. Yeah,
autonomy.
totally.
Yeah,
Can you start by telling us about that? Like about just being a fucking mountaineer?
like how it intersects.
Yeah, do you mind, Faith? Because I
No,
don't
this
even know
is
if you know
great.
this.
Well,
Okay.
and I maybe we can start the story with why you've withheld this information from me for
It's not
over a
relevant.
year.
He's a professional. He's
It's not relevant, and my friends who do know about it, they make fun of me when I bring it up.
Okay.
Like occasionally I'll be like, "Oh yeah, like that time when I was in Wyoming," and they'll like roll their eyes and be like, "Oh, like here's another story about how a moose attacked you," and so I might become very self conscious about it. Going back to it, Tasia, it's pretty rare that anyone brings this up as like that foreshadowed what I do now, and like the values I learned then, like impact the way I think about teams now. So it's pretty rare that actually like people would like draw that parallel. But you're absolutely right. Like, and Tej and I have talked about this not on the podcast, obviously, but like I like living in environments where like there's a lot of things that can kill you.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
I think it forces you to like think differently about like how you behave, how you interact, who you trust, how you try like trusting yourself, right? Like I had several instances back in those days where like I would be with a friend and we would be like in the back country and like the weather would turn and like a binding would break, in a ski. And like you kind of look at each other and it's like, okay, well, we're gonna die. Like if we don't like solve this problem, we're gonna like be dead. Because like it's getting dark, whatever. And and Tasia, it has impacted like how I think about the team. Like I want to hire people who I can trust to be autonomous and to like have it be in a stressful situation and make good decisions and not let the decision or like not let the weight of the consequence like affect their decision making. So yeah, it's like you think about that like my old life, it was like getting down was generally the goal, and like everyone knew that that was the goal. And if people on the gun sales team know that their goal is to bring in lots and lots of clients through outbound, or like really really understand if they're in like a client success role, like what makes our clients tick and what makes them successful, and like that's very clear, then like if we hire the right people, they will make the right decisions to make sure that happens. And my job then becomes like kind of coaching them through it if there's something they haven't encountered before, or to be a sounding board, or to like just share some of my experiences, but not be prescriptive in telling them what to do. Like they know the goal.
Mm.
Like I have to be able to trust them to like deliver it,
Yeah.
which is really no different from like during that time period. I was mountain biking in Moab in August. It was 115 degrees. My rear derailleur broke, and I was like 6 miles away from anything. And I was like, I'm gonna die. And I like had to like fix like I had to, like jerry rig my bike into a single speed to get out, right? And like I don't need people that has that happen and they panic. Like that's not the people I want on the team. Sorry,
Mm.
that's a little
Yeah.
too close. Like I don't mean to like equivocate the
No,
two
that's
completely,
No,
but
it's
like
good.
that helps inform it.
not
And I think it like your management strategy is a lot like that. Like you and Tasia have this in common where like someone will mess up and your response is like, well, no one
you
died.
fucked up. Oh,
Right.
okay.
We're
No.
not doing brain surgery. Or
You fucked up. How dare you? No.
right. Well, I mean, it's that, right? It's like, being accountable, but also
I'm just
like,
kidding.
because I think because we hire people who take their work so seriously, like it's helpful for you to have that perspective, Ben. Like, I'm not 6 miles away from
Yeah,
water and 100 degrees.
yeah. I'm not gonna lose a hand.
Totally. And that's honestly, I mean, that's what really struck me about Ben when we first met was like how much ownership he took um for when there were, let's say, it's like a simple like, oh hey, there's a typo in this thing, or hey, we're not starting this initiative yet. And he's like, listen, I got it. I'm gonna do it. I'm stoked about it. We're gonna get it done. And
Hmm.
it's like that tendency probably comes from like being in those situations and maybe being attracted to those situations where he knows that he's it's incumbent upon himself to solve the situation,
Hmm.
Hmm.
and I think he's done. And same with you, Faith. I mean, you're so involved in the company's hiring process. Like you guys have done an awesome job of bringing in people who have those values.
Well, Ben, today's a like very relevant day to talk to you about sales hiring because we, as of 8 a.m., just announced our Series A raise, which, part of that process is going to be building out some really high impact roles on the team at large, specifically our sales team, which has traditionally been very, very light. So it's, you're like in the headspace already of like, okay, how do I think about scaling this sales team? How do I identify like the metrics that are going to tell me, not only if someone's successful in the role, but also how I know that they were successful in previous roles and how I can use that to measure their potential here. So I guess to start, like, let's just get square on the problem. Like, people struggle with sales hiring. And
Hmm.
if you had to summarize, why do you think that is? Like, what makes sales hiring so hard?
That is, man. I wish I had a better answer or the perfect answer, Faith. I think what
It's
makes
okay.
I think what makes it hard is sort of I don't want to say antiquated, but like the prevailing attitude about what sales is makes it difficult to hire for sales. So what are those like prevailing attitudes? I've been in many, many situations as a candidate where I happen to be, you know, articulate enough, intelligent enough, very outgoing, very extroverted, and that is perceived as, you know, being high functioning, being a highly successful salesperson. I would argue that those things don't mean anything. It may make me fun to be around at a bar sometimes, but it doesn't necessarily make me like a better salesperson. And I think people struggle because they have a hard time. There's this idea of like a Willie Loman type character, or you know, the really friendly guy at the car dealership, or whoever it is. And it's really those people are like good, they're not great. And what makes great salespeople, and this is I think the thing that the hump that we all got to get over, is that they like are extremely persistent and diligent in the day to day. So one of the things that we're implementing, and Tej and I talked about this yesterday, is like a weekly report of like, here's our activity. Like, are we doing the right things every single day? Right. So it's this extreme persistence, extreme diligence, but it's also like having a process, right, that makes sense. And Faith, you're very familiar with this, like our deal stages. but it's also like the discipline to follow it through. And a lot of salespeople may be really charismatic, they may be really outgoing, they may be very extroverted, but they don't have like the diligence to follow through. And they can't like run a play in their head while they're working, right? So they can't think about like, they can't like remove themselves or put space between them and the client and think through, okay, here is this objection. How do I overcome it? Or I don't really know what the buying process is for this client. I'm really going to dig into that and I'm going to ask questions that may feel uncomfortable. Like, are you the one signing the contract? Like, where are you in the high? Like, we've talked about this as a company, but like, hey, Mr. Prospect, where are you in like your hiring cycle for this position? Did you post it a month ago? Did you post it 6 months ago? Like, let's talk about like your process and what's going on. So I think the struggle is people try to line up what like society tells them is good at sales with what like they maybe intuitively know makes someone good at sales, if that makes sense.
Yeah. That leads us really well into a discussion on evaluation, right?
Yeah.
Because if the antithesis of sales hiring evaluation is looking for people who are outgoing and good conversationalists, et cetera, I guess the correct answer would be like, we use qualitative and quantitative metrics
Hmm.
and things that we've decided ahead of time before we actually start that evaluation process to then vet candidates. So I'm curious, like, and Tasia, feel free to jump in whenever, but I'm curious about like what kind of metrics you
Hmm.
look for when you're vetting candidates that aren't just like, can they hold a conversation? Do I think they could
Yeah.
sell me their left shoe? You know?
So the thing I rely on the most is generally in industrial organizational psychology referred to as work sample test. And coincidentally enough, David G, who vets all our developers on the platform, takes the same approach. So if you want to be a developer on gun.io and you have an interview with him, the interview isn't about your philosophy around code. I mean, I'm sure he covers some of that, but like the real crux of it is he has the candidate walk them through a project and their code and explain why they made the decisions they did, right? And like why they put it together this way and why they decided to work on that thing. And I do the same thing for sales. And generally what that means is if you're a candidate for a job, you are selling yourself, right? So I'm looking for, are they checking a couple of different boxes? Are they genuinely curious about gun.io, what we do? Are they curious about the team and the sales team's goals and the standards that we have? And are they curious about me personally or anyone they're interviewing with at the company and like the problems that we have and how they can solve them? Right. So like I'm looking for them to because if they know those things, they can then position themselves to have an honest conversation about where they fit in or where they may struggle even. Right. And so
Mm-hmm.
I kind of, the great thing about sales is that when you're interviewing for a job, you're selling yourself and I get to actually see their work sample test like right in front of me. Like I'm on the receiving end of it. Like a really bad
Right.
sign is someone coming in and I'm like, oh, like, do you have any questions for me? And they're like, not really, but here's a rundown of my resume. Well, that person's going to get on the phone with their prospect and just talk about how great Gun is without knowing anything about the prospect, and they're not going to close anything, right?
Right.
So, like, that's that's like how I'm approaching it with really all our roles, but particularly for
Mm-hmm.
like AEs, client success folks, and even SDRs. I have a
Right.
SDR interview, I think, in 20 minutes. So we'll see what they
Nice.
do.
Well, kind of on that note, like I think a lot of folks that are listening to this are probably in similar shoes as us, right? They're smaller teams. They're trying to be really judicious with how they spend to make sure that there's kind of an ROI with every dollar. And obviously, that's what we're going through right now. So I'm curious if you could walk us through, like, how do we decide from a sales perspective and keeping in
Hmm.
mind we are a services based business,
Yep.
how do we decide who to hire? Who, like, what kinds of roles are going to have that impact for us?
Thanks to your work, Faith, we we've been successful in that, like with inbound, we don't like the company to date has done really well with inbound, right? And so we haven't really hired for skills like prospecting. We've never really hired. I think in the past maybe we've hired some SDRs, but they didn't work out. We haven't really hired anyone in client success because for the most part, the community is sort of taking care of that. We have a very strong product, so we haven't really needed client success. And I think to answer your question about what we're hiring kind of for now for that next step, it's like, well, we do need to have people that have skills more along prospecting and outbound reach out and those types of things. We do need to hire people that are familiar and can set up a client success function to deepen our relationships with our existing clients, right? And to grow with them and to ensure that as they grow, we grow along with them, right? So like what we're looking to hire is really in those areas, not necessarily because what we have now isn't getting it done. It is, but we need to diversify a little bit and we have to get a little bit more niche in who we're going after. And going back to being a small company, like, we're at the stage where we're fortunate enough to do that. Like the balance sheet is strong, the business model is there, right? Like it's time for us to sort of like diversify our customer acquisition strategies and hire specialists who can do those things.
And I'm curious to get Tasia to weigh in on this too, because obviously Tasia's been operating this business for a decade and has done so, in a really kind of lightweight way across all
Yep.
teams, but, sales specifically included. And so I mean, I have this experience too, trying to grow the marketing team. Tasia is super open to getting pitched on team growth.
Yes.
But it's like, rightly so, very kind of tough to convince that like we need to scale teams. So like it's not an easy feat to say, I think we need to hire an SDR or a team of BDRs or account management and just kind of snap your fingers and have that be so. There's kind of a lot of back work involved. And it's a question of like, well, how do you prove out, like Tasia's question is always going to be like, well, what is this person going to drive for us? Right.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of hard to have an answer ready for that when we haven't had anyone do that full time. So how do we kind of manage that on the sales team?
Tasia,
Is
do you
that
want
for
to?
me?
Yeah, do you want to take a shot at that one? And I can, because we went through this process together. So yeah,
You know, so I think the experience probably differs depending on what team you're leading with my encouragement around hiring or lack of encouragement around hiring. I think Ben has received a lot of encouragement from me
yeah,
on
yeah,
hiring. A-
yeah.
And I think the best we can do without ever having done any of these activities at scale is to at least have a working model that has some assumptive inputs on what we expect in terms of performance and cost. And then we can, make sure that lines up with the way we want to spend the money. And generally, like, given where we are today, it probably makes sense to ramp. And I don't know. I like to think I'm not that tough when it comes to approving hires, you know? Um,
Well, it's just different. It's different than what you would have working at like an Amazon, where it's like, well, we have a headcount addition of like 10 slated for this year. So the conversation is much different than us, where like we grow in a really agile way, where
yeah,
quarter over quarter our needs are going to be different. We don't have a set headcount because maybe we need to hire 100 people, maybe we have to hire 0 people, and that's kind of all on the table just depending
yeah,
on how we structure the case.
totally. So maybe I can share a little bit about like capital deployment philosophy when it comes to hiring well. So it's like we're a really small team, and we have a nice balance sheet, but the level of money that we have to go against any specific growth plan is going to be less probably than a large old school staffing firm or recruiting company, right? And so like we have to have a model that in relative terms is going to be way better ROI, right? That means we have to actually hire better, like at the individual level. They have to be directed better, they have to be managed better. And that's the only way we can take market share and grow faster and start to create like gaps between us and other companies. And so I think the philosophy that you and Ben have for your teams around like being really judicious with the use of funds while scaling is like it makes sense for our stage of business that's trying to get to, you know, the next step in size and scale. And so, it's not sufficient for us to like copy and paste an inbound or an outbound strategy from another company. We have to do it better than them,
Right.
right? We have uh,
Hmm.
to be able to continue to grow and continue to be the capital efficient business that we've been.
Right.
So,
Ben, if someone's listening to this, especially kind of your introduction into sales hiring, and they're like, shit, it turns out I'm really bad at sales hiring, which I think, probably a lot of folks feel, whether it's
Hmm.
in feedback, like people I hire turn over really fast, or I spend 3 months on a hiring cycle and I know I could be more efficient than that. Or I keep hiring the wrong kinds of people and they're doing a
Yep.
great job, but it's not delivering benefit. Like, what advice? Oh,
can
go ahead, Tasia.
so we tried to scale our sales team before, and I can give you a postmortem on why it wasn't successful. It wasn't successful because we did not have somebody like Ben being able to quickly assess success in the role and have the tenacity to quickly offboard people who were not having success in the role. And instead, we almost took like a codependent posture when we were like, hey, it's us. They're not managed well, this and that, right? And maybe that's true, but we had pretty clear targets. We just weren't following through on building a process to continue to bring in good SDRs, good account managers, good AEs, and make sure that people were performant like once they were onboarded. And I think that's the magic of having somebody like Ben. We think back to his level of ownership and what he looks for in his team is that like as an exec, Ben is not just thinking about like getting people in, he's thinking about managing them and offboarding them if they are not performant. And like that repeated process of growth, change, growth again, that's what builds a good sales team over time. So I'm not actually convinced that like offboarding somebody in 3 months is like so bad. It's like
Right.
you have to have that because we will hire poorly. Every company does. You just have to
Right.
have the tenacity to make the decision when that happens.
Like you have to know what good looks like to you, right? And so Tasia mentioned the
Yes.
model earlier. I'll use a very specific example. We hired a new AE 3 months ago. She was, I would argue, she was kind of a non-traditional hire in terms of background.
Yeah.
But when we put together this model for the sales team, I I used my kind of best guess based on my experience of what her ramp should be. And the great news is she's hitting it, right? But like I wasn't shy about what her ramp goals were. I think a lot of times sales leaders, to Tasia's point, they kind of adopt that codependent relationship. And it's like, hey, come in. Like this happened to me early in my sales career. It's like, hey, come in, just really do the best you can. We'll talk in 3 months, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And it finally
Right.
took and thankfully I was like self-motivated enough and like figured it out. But like I had a boss who came in several years later who sat me down in a room. He's still by today, he's still a mentor today. And he was like, let's talk about how much money you want to make. And let's talk about how you want your career to progress. And let's just do the math. And like no one had ever done it's embarrassing to admit, but no one had ever done that with me. Right. And so now especially we bring on someone who's on the revenue production side of things, it's like, hey, here's what we expect. Like there's no ambiguity.
Right.
Right. Now, my job is to help you get there. And I'll be honest, anyone who I've ever I've let go because they lacked activity, not because they lacked results. Like someone who's like has a lot of activity and is like willing to learn and willing to be coached. And if I've screened correctly, they'll get there. They may be a little slower to
Mm.
ramp, but they'll get there. And usually they end up like having this like weird like exponential curve. Like there's like nothing, 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 and then they just like fly up. But yet you just have to be very clear. And that the codependent thing's a great word because it's like, hey, this is just what we expect. Like this is
Right.
this is non-negotiable. Now our job is to help you get there, but you got to we can't lead a horse to water.
Yeah, and if it's clear, then everybody knows.
Yeah.
After 3 months, it's not a surprise that that the performance isn't there. If you could kind of determine how every company in the world did sales hiring, what would that look like? Super high level. What are the bullet points that
hmm
should exist in that sales hiring process? And this can kind of double as advice for those hirers who aren't confident when it comes to sales hiring.
So, I mean, I can tell you the things I look for.
In a hiring process.
Yeah. So like these are like people who are talking to clients, right? Trying to close. N- And this, I ripped this off. I can't take credit for it, but HubSpot actually in the early days did this big test on the traits they were interviewing for and assessing for. And number one, to the CRO's surprise, was curiosity. So like I want
Mm,
Mm-hmm.
I want people that I want dilettantes. I want people that they may not know much about, drones, but if you own a drone company and you're talking to them, they're gonna learn everything they can about your business. Right. So that's number one. And I think a lot of salespeople just aren't curious. They're just gonna go through the motions. I think the other thing, and this is a big one for me, and it may be less for other people that have really robust training programs and really big teams, but I want people who are self accountable. And so the way I screen for that is I asked them about something they wanted to improve personally or professionally, and I have them walk me through how they did it. And the best answers always have like several things in common. One is um, they used data to know they were getting better. Two is they relied on outside expertise, whether that's going to YouTube, reading a book, whatever. Three is they developed some sort of accountability and in their community around it. So they got like a spouse, they got like a coworker, even their boss. They created a community. And four is they understood that the process always wouldn't deliver the outcomes they wanted, and they were able to adjust. Right. So
right.
those self accountability is huge for me because I want someone that I don't want to be watching their numbers all the time. I want them watching their numbers all the time. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Right.
And lastly, they got to be somewhat competitive. Like they have to want to win in some capacity. And that can manifest itself in different ways. Like, you know, Tasia does jujitsu, I raise bikes, Faith, you teach a cycling class, right? Like we all have these things that we're trying to get better at and trying to improve on. And I've yet to meet a salesperson that that isn't at least somewhat competitive.
I feel like this is probably true for you too, Ben, because I've spent kind of a lot of time. There's a lot of crossover, obviously, with sales and marketing and kind of when we hand things off. And so I
Yeah.
spent a lot of time over the last 4 years thinking about the customer experience when they sign up for gun.io. What is it that they're coming here looking for, and what do we deliver? And as a result, I've gotten super critical of other people's sales processes. Do you feel that way as well? Like thinking
Yes.
about this all the time and kind of thinking about like how to measure performance salespeople. Do you find yourself being more critical?
Yeah. And I'll tell them a lot of times. I mean, Tasia saw this yesterday.
Oh yeah.
Uh,
Oh yeah.
I
Yeah. There's a company that I introduced to Ben, and we won't mention the company,
we won't
but
mention the company, and like I'm gonna hear the guy out, but he's like, hey, Tasia sent me to talk to you, blah blah blah. And I was like, well, look, man, last time I entertained you guys as a vendor, it was a horrible experience. And not only did the product not deliver, but your sales process I found to be just almost offensive. Not only Faith will I notice it, but if they come back at me or if they approach me and they ask me what I think, I'm going to tell
Yeah.
yeah.
them.
Yeah.
And I hope they
That's
I
true.
change.
mean, I feel like that's the only way you get better.
Right. And here's the thing that I actually respect the person who emailed Tasia and then me because I sent that and then they responded with, hey, I hear you. Some things have changed. Ask me some clarifying. He's he's doing the right thing. He's not shying away from that. He's addressing it. So I think I'm talking to him Friday now. But
Well, that's good, right? Because you called it out as like a critical skill of salespeople is like they can't shy away from difficult conversations.
yeah,
And I think that's kind of a great way to test it. Well, Ben, I feel like there's some golden nuggets in here for both like salespeople looking for their next role, but also people who are charged with hiring salespeople and kind of ways that they can create structure around what otherwise kind of feels like a pile of very chaotic resumes that they need
we
to
have
vet.
lots of
So
we have a big pile right now, Faith. Thank you for your help
Yeah,
with that, by the
yeah.
way.
What are the takeaways? So the takeaways seem to be work sample. Look for a work sample.
Yep.
Ben indexes highly on three qualities: curiosity, competitiveness, and
Self
diligence.
accountability. Yeah.
and to identify those traits up front because a lot of folks
Yep.
will kind of fall back on this shtick of like, oh, a salesperson should be salesy, when really the traits that you're looking for are not being
It's not
salesy.
extroversion. Yeah, it's not
Right,
extroversion.
exactly.
Some of the best people I've hired have been introverts. And I've gotten out that interview
Totally. Yeah.
and I was like, I would never be friends with this person. And then like if I met him on the street, it'd be like, nice to see you. See you later. But they like you listen to their sales call and they crush it.
It's interesting. I mean, one thing is Tyler and I have both been, and Faith too, like we've all been at the tip of the spear from a sales standpoint. And I would say Tyler's probably a little bit more introverted than
Hmm.
us, and I'm maybe a little bit more introverted than you two, right? And I think, you know, I do think that it probably takes more energy to be on a sales call if you're not highly extroverted. Like it's more draining. But to your point, I think if you have the discipline to like overcome that, it's not a big deal. But they have to index highly on accountability then, right? And be like,
Hmm.
hey, I'm gonna get this done. Because it is harder. It's harder to get on the phone for six
Well, it's
hours a
more
day.
draining. Yeah. Like the
100%.
energy is
Yeah.
just less. Yeah.
And I'll say one more point, which is maybe to go meta. If you want to hire a sales leader who hires salespeople, you know, uh, one thing that seems to have worked for us, and I think is working for Ben, is that like at our company we really like people who spike in some sort of uh, independence, self-ownership, accountability. And I think Ben's story about being a mountaineer in Wyoming and Montana. And I'm not even. It's like whatever personality trait you had, Ben, that made you go out there to be
Yeah.
reliant on yourself, and then you cultivated and developed by being there. That's what has led you to have so much success in your career and building the team here. And same with you, Faith. I mean, right? You've done so much like through TFA and through having your own business and like I don't know, like your house projects. So there are like things that show up in a non-professional context
Yeah.
that I think are attractive.
Well, it's whole person hiring, right? Like
Yes.
you have to understand, who they are as a whole person, and the only way you can get to that is, talk to me about life outside work.
Yeah. I mean the second AE we hired is like she's a strong woman athlete.
Yeah. She's a power lifter,
Like
Yeah.
she deadlifts
which we didn't
400
know when we
pounds.
hired her.
Yeah.
Yeah. We didn't know, that's on me. I should have known. I knew in the first week. But hey, in my book, the hiring process doesn't end when you get hired. It lasts
Exactly.
forever.
Exactly. Well, Ben, we're obviously very lucky to have you here building up the sales
Thanks, Faith.
team. For listeners, you can find Ben everywhere on the interwebs. Twitter, I know that you are there. If you're interested in working with gun.io, joining Ben's team, you can find us at gun.io. And then our jobs are always posted on our LinkedIn page. But if you think you are a fit on the team, you don't see a job that fits your skills, shoot us an email. We're always happy to chat. So
Yeah, have a bias towards action, reaching out, because I'll always respect that.
all right, you guys. Well, Ben, you got to jump for an interview, actually. So hopefully this is
Yeah.
a good pregame for it.
Yeah,
All right,
I
we'll
be holding myself
hire
real
some awesome
accountable.
salespeople.
All right, thanks, Faith. Thanks,
All
Tasia.
right, bye, guys. Thanks for listening to the Frontier Podcast powered by gun.io. We drop 2 episodes per week, so if you like this episode, be sure to subscribe on your platform of choice and come hang out with us again next week and bring all your internet friends. If you have questions or recommendations, just shoot us a Twitter DM at The Frontier Pod, and we'll see you next week.